Welcome everybody to this conversation, um, centering active nonviolence in Catholic social teaching, a dialogue, a conversation that began on the blog Catholic Revisions on the Political Theology Network website that was edited by Eli McCarthy, and now transferred to a digital space where we'll hear from three distinguished authors and contributors to that panel today. My name is Jacques Linder. I am a visiting instructor at the College of the Holy Cross and one of the co-conveners of Catholic Revisions. We're grateful to have you join us for this conversation and thank our three esteemed panelists for joining us today. Uh, Quickly, the program will run that we will have each panelist introduce their blog post that they uh, contributed to the conversation. I will ask some critical questions that emerged and themes that came about from each of the uh, posts to all of the panelists to respond to. And then we will turn it over to you, the audience, where there will be time for Q&A at the end, as well as time for the panelists to ask each other questions, especially given our political times in this in thinking about where we can go with our with what we're talking about today. Just a few requests from us on the panel. There will be links that will flow through the chat during the conversation. If you could hold off on using the chat until the Q&A section so that it doesn't distract from what's being said amongst the panel, that would be appreciated. Um, uh, and everything is accessible on politicaltheology.com that we'll be discussing today, and you will receive links through that. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I will introduce the three panelists, and then they will give us a brief summary of their essay. So, first, I'll start out with uh, David Carroll Cochran, who is a professor of politics at Loras College in Iowa. His primary teaching and research interests are war and peace, religion, race, and ethnicity in American politics, political thought, and Irish studies. His most recent book, which I would encourage you to check out, is called The Catholic Case Against War, a Brief Guide, which was published by the University of Notre Dame Press in March of last year. If we go in alphabetical order, that brings us to David DeCosse, who is a director of the Markula Center at Santa Clara. Pardon me, David. At the Santa Clara University in California. He received his AB from Harvard University, an MS in journalism from Columbia, an MA in theology from Fordham, and a PhD in theological ethics from Boston College. He's worked as a journalist and editor and has taught in the religious studies department at Santa Clara University since 1999. And then finally, the editor of the symposium and Eli McCarthy, who teaches at Georgetown in theology as well as justice and peace studies. His recent book is an edited volume entitled A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Nonviolence. He's also published Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers, A Virtue Ethics for Catholic Social Teaching and U.S. Policy. So welcome everybody. Thank you to the panelists for being here. Why don't we begin with Dave Cochran? Could you give us 3 minutes about your blog post?
Sure thing. I appreciate the introduction, appreciate the fellow panelists and the rest of you being here. So just briefly, my contribution kind of keyed off of the Vatican synthesis report before the last year's synod, where they identified issues for further examination, managing conflicts in a nonviolent way, and nonviolence and legitimate defense. So as a political scientist, I was thinking about ways that the literature on armed conflict, what we know about armed conflict from political science, can kind of help center nonviolence in Catholic social teaching as the way it seemed that the Vatican was asking for ideas. One of the challenges I think to this centering is the way the contrast is usually framed. It's often assumed that armed force or military methods or warfare on one hand are kind of assumed to be realistic and effective, maybe unpleasant, but it works, which then kind of puts the onus on nonviolent, non-military methods to kind of prove that they can work. Um, so this conventional wisdom or framing, I think, is a challenge because it turns out, as I kind of try and detail in the piece, that political science research tells us that military methods actually have a pretty poor track record. They don't they have an undeserved reputation for effectiveness or realism. It's not that they never work, but they don't work very well and very often. And also, things like having a more powerful military doesn't actually increase your odds of success when it comes to armed conflict. Militaries are far more likely to actually threaten their own citizens' well-being and security rather than defend them from external enemies. And they're just not very effective at stopping mass atrocities like ethnic cleansing or genocide. In fact, their war itself is the greatest risk factor for these. So I wanted to kind of set a baseline when we're comparing violent and nonviolent, military, non-military methods. I think it's important to have a realistic baseline of just how effective military methods are in practice. And then I turn to, which is probably familiar to many of you, the evidence for the comparative effectiveness of nonviolent resistance methods against dictators, foreign occupiers, more likely to produce democratic regimes in the wake of conflicts than armed conflict. The track record of international institutions and having a solid, though not widely known record of solving disputes before wars break out. Um, and then how we could sort of use certain interventions, nonviolent interventions in areas of chronic conflict to break cycles of violence and civil wars. And then I finally end with some sort of broad-based economic and political factors that are associated with a reduction in the risk of armed violence. So preventing wars before they break out by kind of treating underlying economic and political conditions. So that's kind of the bullet point pitch of what I was addressing in my piece.
Great. Thank you so much. Uh, David DeCoste, would you please give us your 3 minute pitch?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacques, and warm greetings to everyone on the call here. So I approach my pitch from my perspective of having taught the ethics of war and peace to general education undergraduates at Santa Clara for the last 20 years. Santa Clara is a Jesuit Catholic university in Silicon Valley in Northern California. And I found myself over the years really trying to make a pitch for Christian nonviolence and finding a pushback. And I kind of got thinking more and more about why that was with the students. And I mean, there are very important cultural factors that have only become more pronounced, I think, in the last years of a kind of rejection of a sense of love of enemy as sort of incredulous, or sort of prizing of a kind of strong, masculine Jesus that seems antithetical to the supposed weakness of nonviolence. So I think that as kind of a cultural categories to which I think I had to teach, and I think we all have to engage. So, one way I have of thinking of the struggle that I had teaching was coming across in a lot of literature kind of invocations of violence and nonviolence as almost kind of self-evident categories. And violence bad, nonviolence good. And I found myself struggling more and more to try to specify, well, why is violence bad anyhow? And is it always bad? Why is nonviolence good? And in doing that, I found myself drawn more and more to thinking about the importance of almost not relying on that rhetoric as much as always trying to specify and connect that rhetoric to some kind of virtue, practice, context. When I did that, students definitely responded much better to the arguments I was making. I wasn't, so that was one very important thing. And I see that rhetoric of violence and nonviolence happening both in kind of interpersonal contexts. Also, often when we talk about systems, even natural systems of violence, of climate change, I understand that. I'm deeply opposed to climate warming, but often when I hear people say that, I honestly don't understand what they mean. And I think that I'm not alone. I think it's really important to step back from that kind of rhetoric and specify always how that connects to some moral question. Lastly, I thought in teaching about violence and nonviolence that um, it was very important to connect it to political justice, very specifically to things like democracy, to things like totalitarianism, to really ground that in some way, because I think grounding that again provides kind of moral meaning to our invocation of violence and nonviolence. So overall, my piece was, I think, a cry for let us not just rely on the rhetorical power of the language of violence and nonviolence, but let's always work to specify in terms of practices, values, virtues, contexts, why these things are so kind of rich in meaning and important for us to think about in Catholic social teaching. Full stop.
Great. Thank you, David. And then finally, to round us out, Eli.
Hey, thank you so much. Wonderful to be with you all. Really appreciate this opportunity to kind of dive in together and try to learn together. So, a brief kind of summary of my piece was that I focused on the question: how would centering nonviolence in Catholic social teaching impact the analysis and the praxis of legitimate defense? I explain in the piece how this is not the same question as how to prioritize nonviolence. My core argument is that centering nonviolence would shift our focus to defending dignity and alter the style of defense we affirm and spotlight. This style will center practices such as unarmed civilian protection, like the Nonviolent Peace Force, strategic nonviolent resistance, and nonviolent civilian-based defense. So I briefly discuss how the analysis and praxis of legitimate defense has shifted over the 2,000 years of Catholic tradition. Jesus Christ risked and offered his life on the cross to expose the sin of injustice and violence, and thus model and defend his way of love for all. Jesus also accompanied those seeking violent resistance and defense against the Roman occupier by instead drawing them towards breaking the cycle of violence through his transformative style of defense. Recently, Pope Francis has moved active nonviolence to the center of Catholic social teaching. He proclaimed, quote, especially in situations of conflict, let us respect this, our deepest dignity, and make active nonviolence our way of life, unquote. He also argues, in practice, there is no just war, and we should no longer even be using just war language. At the same time, he acknowledges the legitimacy in principle of some form of defense and the need to stop aggressors. So how to defend and what one is defending is still somewhat a gray and developing area for Francis and Catholic social teaching. So I then explain how the inconsistency of killing with human dignity is demonstrated by the advancing scientific recognition of trauma, moral injury, and at times brain damage of the one who kills another in war. Killing is also dehumanizing by obstructing empathy, failing to be a gift to others, devaluing the sacred gift of others, and generating ongoing trauma, not only in the parties directly involved, but also in the community members. I then turn to unpacking nonviolent defense and identify an associated just peace moral framework. I describe the research and practices of unarmed civilian protection, strategic nonviolent resistance, and nonviolent civilian-based defense, such as Czechoslovakia in 1968 against the Soviet invasion. I then end by referring to Cardinal Bo from Myanmar, who wrote a letter to the Synod in 2023, where he stated, quote, "An official church teaching on nonviolence and just peace and inclusion in the Catechism of the Catholic Church of a robust description of nonviolence, key nonviolent practices, and the norms of a just peace ethic would deepen Catholic understanding of and commitment to gospel nonviolence and help inspire a global embrace of nonviolence," unquote. So I offered two recommendations to update the church's teaching in the Catechism and the Social Compendium. The first one is a robust section on gospel nonviolence and just peace moral reasoning. This would include a clear call for the church to center nonviolence and just peace, a broad description of what we mean by nonviolence, key nonviolent practices to scale up, like nonviolent communication, unarmed civilian protection, restorative justice, including the meaning, the strategies, and the impact of nonviolent defense, and the guiding norms of a just peace ethic. And the second recommendation was that we need a consistent ethic of dignity. Governments have a responsibility to transform conflict in a sustainable way, consistent with just peace and human dignity. And as a church, we will embody, invest, and advocate for creative, effective, nonviolent forms of defense. So those were two recommendations for the Social Compendium and the Catechism.
Great. Thank you so much, Eli, for that overview of your blog post and to all the panelists. So we'll now shift into some critical questions meant to put your pieces in dialogue together. Each question might be directed at someone, but they could also, other people can jump in, of course. So to start, I was struck by David DeCost's charge about the risks that we might run into employing the term violence or nonviolence in moral, systemic, and political discourses on violence. He notes in his blog post, and I think said a couple minutes ago to the same effect, that, quote, "In the phrasing of advocates for nonviolence, both within and outside of the church, the word violence has become a catch-all abstraction to explain and condemn the malevolent meaning of complex processes," end quote. He invokes different thinkers, such as Eli McCarthy and Hannah Arendt, on ways that scholars' processes of description could be specified, not pejoratively suggest that everything is violent, rather thinking about how violence functions and against whom it functions. So thinking with David and his argument, maybe to the two other panelists, to what extent do you agree with David's argument? How would you specify, and are there specific contexts that you think about, or how would you specify violence in specific contexts where it's present? And then in turn, how do you define nonviolence in those similar contexts that we're thinking about? So it's a question about definitions about these terms, as well as how you go about thinking about these terms to sort of avoid that rhetorical piece that David DeCoste is pointing us to.
Well, Jacques, I'll let my esteemed colleagues respond. I will just say I also want to make clear about this, just because I think it helps contextualize what I'm saying. I deeply support the church's turn to nonviolence and the promotion of that as an ethic at the core of Catholic social teachings. So my critique is in service to that aim. I'll stop there.
I'll just add that I was struck and largely agree with the problem we often run into with terms like violence, because in political science we have a similar problem with things like terrorism or genocide, right? Which might have a specific meaning in, say, international law, or people have different definitions, but because they're so morally charged, they can become kind of inflationary sometimes, like anything bad is terrorism, anything bad is violence. So I agree with David's identifying of a certain problem is you have to kind of keep in mind exactly what you mean when you're using some of these terms, which can become inflationary or vague because they come to describe anything that's harmful or bad. So yeah, I do agree with the sort of the basic premise of needing to keep terms understood in a particular context.
Yeah, I echo that appreciation for David's piece. It's very nuanced and I think helpful. Like I like his argument. He says, "quote The concept of nonviolence makes far more sense to students when it's embedded within a context and a purpose, like the Gospels or the American Civil Rights Movement." Or the work of Chenoweth and Stephan on the success of nonviolent resistance. And then he also, at another point, draws on another scholar who says, quote, "In the course of experiencing violence, we are harmed. We experience the bad of physical pain. In the course of this experience, we are also wronged. The imposition of such force violates our sense of self-respect." So I find this interesting because for me, this seems to kind of open a window to what I try to extend and argue that violence is action that is inconsistent with human dignity, i.e., it's dehumanizing. Whereas physical force is not always violent. For example, if it doesn't cause significant harm or doesn't dehumanize. So it leads to a question for me. Seems like a key aspect of the clarification process is asking, like, how does physical force function? Right? Does it dehumanize? Is it causing significant harm to person or the environment? So as I kind of lean into that, I think of violence as that which dehumanizes, that is, when we live in discord with our dignity, we fail to be a sacred gift, we lower our empathy, we generate trauma or destruction of people or the earth. So violence isn't any kind of harm like a scratch or rudeness or a surgery. And it's not any kind of physical force, like if someone's out on the street and they're about to get hit by a car and we run out and we push them out of the road. Like it was physical force, but it's not dehumanizing or causing significant harm. So, I think David also draws on Galtung in his piece, who offers a way to understand violence as direct, like assault or psychological abuse or killing, as structural, like housing discrimination, and as cultural, and that each of these forms are violent insofar as they are what Galtung calls avoidable obstructions of basic human needs. And they also kind of enable each other. So cultural violence is anything that justifies or legitimizes direct violence and structural violence, like our language, ideology, styles of reasoning. So, for nonviolence, I tend to think of that as a positive reverence for dignity and life, as well as the constant effort to avoid dehumanization and participation in other types of violence, such as structural or cultural. I'll leave it there. See.
I'll just add one more thing that occurred to me is that sort of the flip side of problems defining violence and it becoming sort of a synonym for anything that's bad is oftentimes not, might fall into the trap of just assuming anything nonviolent is good and noble and just. Whereas in the kind of literature that I focus on, nonviolent methods are kind of an alternative form of shaping state behavior or other people's behavior. It can be coercive, and it doesn't always, it's not guaranteed to work for noble ends. So people can use nonviolent methods in ways that might actually undermine justice or liberty if local officials refusing to enforce non-discrimination laws, for example, things like that. So nonviolence maybe suffers from some of the same problems that David associates with or identifies with violence.
Maybe just a closing thought, or we can keep going on this too. But Um, I think in making the critique, I actually have thought as well of sort of a recovery of the Christian sources on kind of why, when violence is wrong, it is wrong, as Eli pointed out in the piece. And that struck me too in my teaching. I think students really connected with that. When violence is wrong, it's wrong because it damages. I love Eli's use of the word dignity, and I love also unpacking that. There's a way it diminishes so profoundly. I mean, both life it can, but also a sense of self-respect. You lose your sense of agency for determining, your own life in some way, and that I think we cannot move past that. But I also am thinking about, I remember way back during the time of the Iraq War, and Archbishop Rowan Williams from England being in an argument, I think it was with George Weigel over various aspects of things at that time. And Archbishop Williams, sort of made the point, which may seem obvious, but I don't think we always perhaps think about it enough in terms of this discussion, that, the body of Christ before, it is a context of not just nonviolent, of love offered freely and received freely without coercion. That is our Christian kind of reality and dream, certainly, primarily and out of our conviction. And only do coercion and violence kind of come after, so to speak, that kind of, I'll call it moment or conviction. And I like that a lot. It helps me think about why violence is wrong, in another way. The one other thing I'd say, and I think this may be a little problematic, but I think I've got to say it, is I do worry too in our conversations within the Catholic community about violence and nonviolence, the degree to which languages of, say, postmodern identity, even post-colonial thought, sort of take over the logic of a Christian engagement with violence and nonviolence. And I think those social theories can be very illuminating, but in ways they can also be problematic from a Christian point of view, insofar as they kind of contain either fairly explicit or even implicit kind of Marxist, materialist, physicalist logic that I hope that we can really distinguish our discussions about violence and nonviolence from that logic.
Great. Thank you all and for that initial engagement. And of course, as the audience might be percolating on some questions too, especially about that last point. David, thank you. So, for our second sort of critical question, Catholic social teaching or Catholic social thought as well, and maybe we'll use the larger bubble of thought here, is usually understood as a series of principles that scholars use to normatively account for a particular situation and judge the situation against those principles. For example, in his essay in this series, Eli McCarthy spotlights how centering active nonviolence within Catholic social teaching would shift our focus to defending dignity and alter the style of defense we affirm and spotlight, particularly the practices of unarmed civilian defense. To the other panelists, what is your sense of this argument about nonviolence shifting our focus about defending dignity and the style of defense that manifests in these practices? Some of you have already hinted at your answers there. And then is there a theme or two of Catholic social teaching that emerges for you as you imagine the relationship between CST and nonviolence that might be different from dignity, or maybe it's strongly in there? How does our discussion of nonviolence challenge either the scholarly or perhaps popular understandings of that CST principle? And again, naming the specific, what practices might actualize as you think about this relationship between the CST principles and active nonviolence.
I can jump in here to get going. First of all, I really thought the Catholic Revisions blog contained so much to respond to your good question, Jacques, on this. I thought there was just so much great thought about the problems, like the breaks between kind of Catholic social teaching and moral theology, and the need for more dialogue there, or Casey's piece about Lederach and his whole sets of practices to adopt. So I would direct people there. I thought that was great. I think a couple of things come to me. I'll note. One is again going back to Eli's use of the notion of dignity. I think that notion is so powerful, and I think we can use it almost. I think it'd be great to specify that more and more when we use it. What do we mean by that as Catholics? And I think here the thing for me that especially comes up if I think of Eli's phrase "deepest dignity," is this inalienable worth attached to every human being? And I think, especially in our nationalist populist context right now, that is a hard benchmark that differentiates us. And I think establishes a sense of kind of infinite and tremendous value that calls into question um, the use, certainly, of arbitrary violence. So deepening the notion of dignity. And the other one that I'm struck by, and I think I got this if I from Edgar Lopez's piece that I thought on the Revisions blog, where Edgar talked about the importance of solidarity with victims. And I think here I've been thinking more about Rene Girard and his ideas of nonviolence. And I mean, he is very popular with the contemporary right these days. And thinking more and more about that, I can kind of see why. I think he offers a critique of sort of victimization that is very persuasive to people. But I think when I read and think about Girard's critique, I think what's missing is a true solidarity with victims, a true entering into the life of what it's like to experience terrible violence and have your life just either destroyed or upended. And I think within the Catholic community, we have the resources to do that, engage that, and tell those stories. And I think we need to.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I really appreciate Eli's sort of focusing on when we use the word defend or defense, we have to think hard about what we're actually defending, right? What and who, and this idea, national security versus human security. Defending human security versus defending national security can lead you in some very different ways. And I like that it got me thinking about this issue of defense is all around us. Even Eli uses the way Jesus defended certain things, right? But for some reason, we tend to cede to the state or the political community this almost blank check to use lethal defense, right? Whereas some ethicists have pointed out that a company facing a hostile takeover that will eliminate its very existence, if they started assassinating stockbrokers to protect themselves, that would seem to be absurd, right? Or if my university decided to eliminate the political science department, defending by like launching drone strikes against the administration would be absurd as well. So there's lots of threats and there's lots of ways human communities defend themselves, but it almost seems automatic that we allow states to use lethal violence as a defense where we don't accept that in other areas of important human defense, right? So yeah, I really like this idea of thinking, what are we defending? And then how that informs what the appropriate way to defend is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. Maybe just a couple thoughts. One, you asked about principles. So I think a little more on human dignity, right, which is a core principle of Catholic social teaching, is like in our context in the US, we got to be careful that we don't simply describe it as being about choice, right? The sort of Western liberalism tendency. But it's more so about how to be a gift or living in accord with being a gift, increasing empathy, reducing trauma. So it's also not this kind of like self possessiveness or what we see often a kind of national possessiveness or nationalism. Um, so that it doesn't. So when we think of mass killing for defense, it's hard to argue that that's consistent with self-respect or dignity because of how it traumatizes the self um, and many in the community and lowers empathy. The other principle, the priority of those most in need or option for the poor, I think it can help us see that war, even in plain self-defense situations, harms the poor, the children, the elderly, disabled the most. So if we are to prioritize them, then we would focus on other styles of defense uh, rather than mass violence as a form of defense. And then I'll just, I really love Pope Francis's quote in Fratelli Tutti, where he says, "We need to go beyond theoretical discussions to gain insight and touch the wounded flesh of victims." He says, "Let us look at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Think of the refugees and displaced, the mothers who lost their children, the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear the true stories and look at reality through their eyes." I think particularly about Palestine and Gaza today. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war, nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace.
Thank you for that. Powerful quote to leave us on there, Eli, as we continue to think more about dignity and the other sort of CST themes. Okay, so then our uh, next question revolves around ideas about CST and interdisciplinarity. As Dave Cochran brings us his essay about a series of economic and political factors that are most likely to coincide with lower odds that a country might experience war and experience less violence within the sovereign country itself. Uh, and he's also coming to us to this conversation with political science or with a political science background. I'm wondering for David or for Dave, as well as for the panel, how can we think about these distinctions about the disciplinary backgrounds that each of us come from? And then perhaps more specifically to the other panelists, how does Dave's analysis and promotion of the political science contributions to CST challenge your own understanding of CST? So how do we think about sort of the relationships amongst of these different disciplines in this conversation? Of course, from the outset, maybe also naming the arbitrary nature of disciplinary borders as well, which might answer the question, but would love each of the panelists' thoughts there too.
Yeah.
Well, just to start off, I found the interdisciplinary dialogue very affirming when I kind of started getting into this area of research and writing. I was familiar with Catholic social teaching, the encyclicals, and students probably you might have experienced this as well. This idea of more democracy, more human rights, more economic development, sustainability, like all the things that the encyclicals talk about, kind of this global peacemaking agenda, struck me as that sounds great. That's wonderful. That's idealistic, right? But then when I dig into the evidence from political science, it's actually pretty realistic as well. The actual data support if you work on these things, you get less warfare. So I found it kind of enriching that it's Catholic social teaching wasn't just a noble, aspirational, idealistic hope, but it's grounded in some actual data from armed conflict research.
Yes, I really appreciated Dave's piece. I found the data to be, to me, in thinking about CST and nonviolence, very persuasive. I will say in my class, when I brought in Chenoweth and Stefan and their data, it is extremely helpful for the students for me, for they engage in that data. I have just a reservation that's been articulated. Data is always disputable. I sort of would love for us to keep, the emphasis on kind of, well, what's the Christian imperative about what we're doing? But I'll just note that in terms of interdisciplinarity too, I do find myself thinking more old English major that I am in ways, but of the power of literature in kind of helping to accomplish the kind of formation that I think our overall blog talked about and that's come up. How do we start inviting people to consider the kind of practices and virtues, the destructiveness of violence and nonviolence in a more meaningful way? And I just note this because it's been recent and I found it very powerful. Both the book and now the series, the Hulu series of Say Nothing. Perhaps some of you saw that about Northern Ireland and the Troubles. It was sort of a biopic, actual murder by the IRA of someone they considered an informer. She was not. And then the book investigates kind of how this played out over decades for the members of the IRA who were immediately involved in that murder. And it is to me, a very powerful narrative about the destructiveness of violence, even in service to what we could say is a just cause. Very powerful. It really changed my assessment of things. And we're all different readers and, of literature, watchers of films, but I was struck by that and thought, oh, this is great. I'd love to sort of use things like this in teaching more.
Yeah, thank you both. Dave, it's really a joy for me to be able to learn more from the political science and social science spaces. So really appreciate all the work you've done to kind of keep that available different audiences. I think one of the things I draw from his piece is that it's important to root our understanding and application of Catholic social teaching principles in the reality of human experience as best as we can. So when it comes to war, Dave says it turns out that when we're weighing warfare's costs, benefits, and odds of success, its overall record is surprisingly weak. Even successful wars are ruinous, unquote. So that seems to suggest that claiming we can ensure the principle of human rights through the practice of war doesn't seem to hold up to reality in many ways. And that claiming we can ensure the principle of the priority for the most vulnerable through the practice of war also doesn't seem to hold up. And claiming we can defend human dignity, as we've discussed, through war also doesn't seem to be largely consistent with reality. On the other end, the nonviolent resistance, right, you say, quote, there's a great deal of support in political science for the greater effectiveness of these approaches, both for political conflicts and communities when they have to defend themselves. So it seems if we want to better ensure the CST principles of rights, priority for the most vulnerable, care for creation, illuminate human dignity, then it seems based on the research that we're kind of called to focus on, advocate for, invest in, educate about the broad range of nonviolent actions to both transform political conflicts and defend against aggression. So thank you.
Great. So we have about 12 minutes left, and I have one more question that I prepared. So maybe if the panelists could be quick with this one, even though it, and then and the question will sort of shift us to Q&A as well. So if any audience members are starting or excited to join into the conversation, start forming your questions and maybe typing them in the chat. Uh, Pope Leo recently commented that, quote, nonviolence as a method and a style must distinguish our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, end quote. I don't need to tell everyone what atrocities are happening across the world in this moment, from Palestine and Gaza, the Ukraine, Congo, among many others. But for the panelists, how do you imagine, or what do you think are, the next set of critical questions for Christians to engage with nonviolence? Are there spaces to discern and practice this method? As well as attempt to enact it in the world?
Oh, I'll jump in right away. Yes, absolutely. The space is already with us, and it's only being intensified by the billions of dollars being directed in the last budget to the Homeland Security Department. It's on us, to me, to assist our brothers and sisters who are undocumented, who are citizens, who have legitimate visas, whatever. That is the space I believe is just crying out for accompaniment, Eli's great term, and nonviolent action on behalf of the Catholic community.
Yeah, I would just add, I would also kind of flip the question, and the default should be Christians looking to engage with nonviolence. The critical question should be Christians who advocate the use of violence, especially when it comes to, say, warfare, right? I didn't mention in the piece, but by some measures, going to war carries about a 15% success rate. You're about 15% likely to succeed in your goals if you go to war, which is the same if you're a football or soccer fan of your keeper saving a penalty kick. It's not very good. So for someone who's advocating something that has about a 15% success rate, I think they should face the critical questions rather than the other side.
Yeah, and just briefly, I would say a key question is how do we better prepare for strategic nonviolent resistance before and during mass violence? So both David's point about the immigration detainment violence that is happening, but also, the case in Gaza, there's importance to figure out how to better prepare for that kind of resistance and use it during mass violence. And then I think another important question beyond kind of legitimate defense question, which I looked at in my piece, was, what ethical framework or style of moral reasoning would better guide us to engage conflict constructively, break cycles of violence, and build a sustainable peace? So, I and others have proposed a just peace framework that could be refined and improved, or other moral frameworks could be proposed.
Great. Thank you all. If you start having questions, you can either put them in the chat or put your hand up. I see that Simon Mary has a question. I could read it, but would you also like to unmute and ask yourself too?
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks again for a lovely presentation. My question is this, I'll just read it. If interdisciplinarity is to be centered in nonviolence, consciousness, and praxis, why not begin to explore how nonviolence, consciousness, and praxis are themselves grounded in a decolonial tone? Perhaps this is where this consciousness can take hold on the imagination of those working against the colonial matrix inherent in violence. Why I'm bringing this up is to take it beyond the domain of Christian spiritual praxis and other stuff, to ground it in what Dave Cochran rightly said about the power of the CST and its concrete relevance in sociopolitical thought and praxis. So I think it is beyond just a spirituality, but it's a way of life. It's a way, a methodological response to colonial matrix of power and violence. So I'm thinking, I think the nonviolence movement is still held captive, though this is where I disagree with David Cox. It's still held captive by a Christian spiritual understanding rather than take it beyond the boundaries and take it to the secular domain. So just a thought.
Suppose I should respond to Simon Mary. First, hello, good to see you.
Likewise.
I guess Simon Mary, I would just see it sort of differently. I would like the nonviolence movement indeed to be held captive by Christian spirituality. I think the challenge to me is to kind of deepen that spirituality. And as I think the Catholic Revisions blog kind of lays out in many of the pieces, kind of enter into this gap where we haven't sufficiently developed that spirituality, sets of practices, connecting kind of Catholic moral theology with Catholic social teaching. I think there's a lot of room there to do that. And I do not discount so many critiques that come out of post-colonial, decolonial world, but I do worry that a lot of it can contain this kind of binary, essentially kind of materialist logic that is antithetical to Christian nonviolence.
Mark, would you like to share your question? Or I can read it too.
Oh, no, that's okay. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah, it's not quite interdisciplinary, but I was thinking of other theological disciplines, right? And both David and Eli, I think, invite us to consider some of those. I'm just curious, the panel, what other kind of Christian areas, topics, theological topics, would you see as being a way to, again, kind of seed the ground for high school students, college students, whoever it is that we're teaching, even before or outside of CST?
Yeah, I think one core place in the Catholic community is Eucharistic theology and how we understand what we're doing when we're approaching, receiving, and acting out of the experience of the intimacy of the Eucharist, and what Jesus is modeling for us in that particular remembering and re-embodying kind of liturgical moment.
Here to Eli's suggestion. And Mark, the other thing I'd say, and perhaps this is already so evident to you, but I'll just say it because I think it warrants a real kind of re-articulation in our time, is love of enemy. I think that is something that it's been explicitly rejected by the president. He's just like, that's a bad idea. And there is so much of this kind of masculinist, I'll say, because I don't want to, sort of reinterpretation of Jesus in opposition to something like love of enemy today. That is, I think it's not just kind of nutty over on the side. It's like it is at the core of our culture right now. So I think for a Catholic rearticulation, reappropriation of that would be great.
Yeah, I totally missed that. Trump said that at some point.
He did. Said it was a bad idea.
I think we might have time for one more question. Or if the audience does, you can raise your hand, or if you don't have one, if any of the panelists want to have a question for each other as well.
I have a quick question.
Yes, thank
to
you.
the panel. Do you have some resources for us where we could just get some more information and context of this idea of love of enemy?
Well, I mentioned it, but I'm actually going to look to Eli for having some more information on this. apart from the gospel passage, I think, of course, of I guess I'm drawn back to narratives of the great stories of saints known and unknown who have really lived that out, and all. So Eli, do you mind if I call on you there, my friend?
Mm, Thanks, David. I guess the one thing that comes to mind is Martin Luther King had a short kind of piece on love of enemy. Um, Not any more details about what that was in, but I know he wrote a piece on that. And I think the other thing that comes to mind is just the practice of nonviolent communication, which is often billed as like an interpersonal practice, but it is this invitation to try to listen for the needs behind somebody's position or behavior. So even when we disagree with their behavior or their political positions, there's often unmet needs behind that. And I think love of enemy in part is about being willing to try to identify those and then make proposals for maybe healthier strategies or strategies that actually get those needs and the needs of other people who are impacted met. And I think that can show up in, um, government foreign policy situations as well.
I see Marie.
Yes, Marie Dennis, please.
Yeah, just quickly, I would also, in thinking about love of enemy, I think a lot more thinking needs to go into what Pope Francis was trying to do, where as he interacted, for example, with Putin. I think it's a huge lesson that has kind of gone by unnoticed. And I just want to thank you all for this. It was just enormously helpful, and thank you.
Thank you for the audience for their questions, their participation. Thanks to the panelists. We can give a little electronic applause and thank you all for joining. We appreciate your participation. Please keep in touch with the Catholic Revisions blog, where on the Political Theology Network, where this was coming from, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your Monday. So thank you all again, and thank you.
Thanks, Laura.